Now let's go ahead and look at slide 10. So we'll talk about some other early KMT leaders. Song Jiaoren was an early proponent of democratic government. He really believed in it. He really did believe that once the people don't want to vote for us anymore, we should be out. He was a founder of the precursor, the predecessor party of the KMT, which was the Tongmenghui, and a critic of Yuan Shikai, and that's what got him killed. He was getting ready to travel up to Peking. He was at the Shanghai railway station in 1913 when a gunman came up and shot him. It was probably Yuan Shikai's people who were after him at that point, but the actual murderer remains a mystery to this day. Liao Zhongkai, another relatively democratic individual. This, you might call this the democratic phase of the early Kuomintang. No more democracy really until the 1980s. Liao Zhongkai was actually born in the United States. He was also a founder of the Tongmenghui and a close associate of Song Jiaoren. He was also a leftist and wanted cooperation with the USSR and was an early proponent of bringing the Chinese communists into the Kuomintang, as happened in the first United Front phase that began in 1921. He was assassinated in 1925, probably by a man named Hu Hanmin, not directly, but Hu Hanmin hired the assassins. An interesting element about this is that his son Liao Changzhi, who is pictured below there, became a top CCP underground official and later a diplomat who was responsible for upgrading relations with Japan after World War II. Going on to slide 11. So then there were the bad boys of the KMT. There were a lot of bad boys in the KMT, really. A lot of bad boys in the CCP, too. It's not any sort of mutually exclusive thing. Hard times. These were very hard times, very cruel and difficult times for China. And in order to politically survive, one had to be cruel and difficult. I guess there's really no better way of putting it. So here we are, studying cruel and difficult people. Hu Hanmin was also a KMT founder. In the early 30s, he criticized Chiang Kai-shek for being weak in the face of Japan. And it's hard to say how genuine he was in this criticism. A lot of people were saying this sort of thing, but it was the politically expedient thing to say at the time. We'll discuss a little bit more about that probably in 20 minutes or so. He became the strongman of Guangdong. He was he had to be cultivated by Chiang Kai-shek in order to maintain his coalition of leaders that kept the KMT together. He ended up dying of illness in 1936, and I imagine for Chiang Kai-shek it was not a moment too soon. Wang Jingwei became a even more difficult individual. He made many attempts to overthrow Chiang Kai-shek in the leadership, not by force, but by guile. He had his own supporters in the early days of the KMT. He tried to politic his way to the top leadership, and was and Chiang Kai-shek got the best of him time after time. We'll discuss some details of a couple of those incidents in a few minutes. And then in 1938, he pretty much gave up and moved himself to another part of China, away from KMT power, so that he could have contact with the Japanese. And the sole purpose of this, in retrospect, seems to have been so that he he could conduct a series of negotiations with the Japanese to settle on conditions under which he would come over to their side and head up their puppet government, which he did in 1940. If you see the movie Lust, Caution, which is a really good movie, and I would have recommended it for this course, but as you might know, that's L-U-S-T, caution. As you might know, the movie was quite controversial when it came out about 5 years ago because of its violent sex scenes. And I'm no dummy. I don't want somebody complaining that I assigned a film that is inappropriate. So I'm just noting that Lust, Caution exists out there. However, it won many awards, and its depiction of Nanjing and the Wang Jingwei regime, although it's not any sort of blow-by-blow historical account, its depiction of that regime in those times, in the early 1940s, is very true to the atmosphere of the period. So let's see. Then there was Jiang Shuiliang, who also opposed Chiang Kai-shek, but for a different reason, because he wanted to see, once the anti-Japanese war got going, he wanted to see, or before it got going, when Japanese aggression was becoming outrageous in the early 1930s, he wanted to see the KMT return to its united front with the communists in order to better resist the Japanese. And indeed, he had a number of communist agents of influence, both of the espionage variety and of the psychological warfare variety on his staff, and ended up surprising both Chiang Kai-shek and the communists themselves and Stalin in Moscow by kidnapping Chiang Kai-shek on 12 December 1935 when he was there visiting in order to try to whip Jiang Shuiliang back into line and be a good anti-communist. Didn't work out very well. Anyway, there were problems for Chiang Kai-shek all through his leadership until he ended up having to leave China in 1949 on the eve of the communist victory, with maintaining this coalition of people. Let's go on then to slide 12 and talk about the Jimo himself. He became known as the Generalissimo. In 1926, the foreign media writing in English began to call him that. I can't think of any Chinese equivalent. I don't think there's an equivalent to Jimo or the Generalissimo in Chinese. By the way, just like there's no equivalent to Maoism in Chinese, there's no such thing. There is Mao thought. There is no Maoism, but everybody uses Maoism, so never mind. I won't get started on that. It's a petty point. Chiang Kai-shek was a very talented individual, and perhaps his greatest talent was his determination and his perseverance. His wife, Song Mei-ling, his eventual final wife, Song Mei-ling, considered herself to be much smarter than him, and indeed that's probably true, but she nonetheless, as Taylor says in one of the optional readings, nonetheless considered him to be a very great man. And indeed he was. We have to admit that, in spite of all the bad press that the Jimo has had over the years. It's very interesting that he became this figure very much like Yuan Shikai, except more effective. He was a very pragmatic individual, and he gained a position in the party, in the Kuomintang, in the Chinese Nationalist Party, where he was the indispensable man. There was nobody else who could unite all the disparate generals, who could unite all the cliques within the Kuomintang and keep them together. And so from time to time, he realized that he could, in order to whip people into shape, he could resign and withdraw. And indeed he did, several times, as you can see in our readings. And in each of these instances, his withdrawal, his resignation, his disappearance up to the mountains caused chaos within the party. When he did it, for example, at one point when Wang Jingwei was trying to take over the party in 1926, and everything started to fall apart. There were too many people, generals, senior military officials in the party who were utterly opposed to Wang Jingwei and who would have started the civil war if Wang Jingwei would have been elected leader of the KMT, and he was the only other person who might have been elected leader of the KMT, being as well a long-term rival of Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Jieshi, or Jiang Zhongzheng. All these different names, these different people. I know it's very confusing, but I've tried to line them all up for you here. So, Chiang Kai-shek had as one of the tasks of the dying Sun Yat-sen the task of leading a northern expedition, which he himself proposed in about 1923 or 24, as I recall. And he indeed led that northern expedition. He did so with great talent, and it wasn't as if he did it the best way it could ever have been done under every circumstance, but he did it in the best way probably that could ever have been done under those circumstances, forging alliances, bullying, cajoling, bribing, flattering his way to a more unified KMT that could actually push north and get rid of the previous chaotic conditions that had existed. And during World War II, he and his wife, Song Mei-ling, became the international symbol in the West of China's resistance to Japan. We'll talk more about that next week. Let's go on to slide 13. Now, on slide 12, I noted in one of the bullets that Chiang Kai-shek was from the same province, Zhejiang, as Zhou Enlai, who was a senior communist leader. And there were times when Chiang Kai-shek pulled the fat out of the fire for Zhou Enlai on a personal basis, getting him out of jail. And they communicated with each other over the years. Zhou Enlai kept Chiang Kai-shek informed of what was going on in the opening to America in 1971-72 through their secret channels that they had set up to communicate with each other, in spite of the fact that Taiwan was, of course, the enemy, sworn enemy of the Chinese communists. These two men remained, you might say, friends, and communicated privately over the years. And that's because of this thing that people call guanxi. We're on slide 13 now. Guanxi means connections. And it's sort of like, in our culture, we talk about how it's not what you know, it's who you know. But in China, that's true 17 times over. It's much more of a reality than it is in the West. It's rooted in several things, but the most important of these things are that there is no tradition of legal protection in China, period. There is a form of legal protection that's in place now, but it's relatively meaningless on the mainland, that is. It's relatively meaningless because the Chinese Communist Party retains supreme power and the courts don't mean nothing. If the party wants something done, then the courts will do it. Judges in the PRC today are party members, and they follow party orders. You can't rule against the party in a legal case. It's just not done. Lack of legal protections. There may be legal protections on the books in China today, and they have some meaning in limited context, but for the most part, they're worthless. So how do you guarantee that you're going to get things done and you protect yourself in business dealings and so forth in that kind of environment? You do it through personal connections. In other words, the most important personal connections in China are between members of the same family. You could consider that the inner circle of a series of concentric circles. So first there's family, then there are people from the same village or part of China, then there are people from the same province, then there are people who have some other set of connections, and of course these connections can be strong or weak. It's not that the last one is worth less than the first one. Sometimes it can be worth almost as much to have solid connections with someone who's not a relative than it can be to actually be a relative. But the thing is that that these connections are so important because there's a lack of institutional protections for business and other dealings, that if you were to betray one of these connections by doing something that you were expected not to do, whether it's not respond to help or not keep your mouth shut under difficult circumstances or whatever, then the social accountability you would be held to would be quite severe. You could actually lose everything that you have that comes from other people. So, as a result of this, you'll see in modern Chinese literature and in ancient Chinese literature, people who are heroes in the literature are people who stay true to their guanxi, to their true connections that are the things that really mean the most in life in the face of institutional pressure. And there's some communist propaganda that runs the opposite direction, but very few people really buy that sort of thing. Let's go on to slide 14, and you can look at this and have a laugh. Switch off my recording and look at the thing. What I find interesting about this is the artistry, because you'll notice several things about this cartoon that indicate where it was drawn. Who drew it? Did an American draw this? Well, probably not, because if you look at the courtroom scene, the judge has got a wig on. There's a cross. Looks like a Christian cross there in back of the judge's seat, which is kind of weird. You don't have that in America. And so on. And then you notice that the police are wearing funny European-looking hats. And the other thing I noticed about this cartoon is that everybody has a gigantic nose. And if there's one thing that Chinese artists always do when they depict a Westerner, it's that they give them a gigantic schnoz. And one of the pejoratives in the Chinese language for a Westerner is da bizi, is a big nose foreigner. So because also of the way that the caption is constructed in English there, I would say this probably came from China, but can't prove it. Slide 15. So this is a scene from the classic guanxi literature of China, Water Margin. It's a great book. You can get it in English. You can read it in translation. If you can get it, I recommend you do. Just for your spare time pleasure reading. It's a rambunctious and roiling novel. It's quite something, and a number of television serials have been made out of it. It's more popular in China than are the Chronicles of Narnia, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, War and Peace, and all the Star Wars and Star Trek flicks combined in the West. And it is a story basically about how a group of bandits who get together because they have been wronged by imperial authority wander through China looking for a place to escape from imperial authority. And as they go, different members of the bandit clan are suddenly become crucially useful because a local official is related to them or something, and you have here a scene out of Water Margin where Liu Da, who is a major in the Chinese military with the local garrison out in western China, there is happens to be related to somebody in the bandit gang, and he's come to see them to tell them that he has orders to destroy them and they should get ready to flee the area. We'll stop here and go on to slide 16.